Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping right into one of the biggest questions out there. What shapes our world more? Is it our economy or is it our culture? We're going to break down the classic idea of the base and superstructure to try and figure that out.
So let's really think about this. What's in the driver's seat of society? Does the economy dictate our values, or is it our beliefs, our laws, our political systems that end up building our economy? This is a question that's been at the very heart of some huge debates for well over 150 years.
Well, one of the most powerful answers comes from a really simple idea, a metaphor, really. The philosopher Karl Marx asked us to picture society as a building, with two really key parts. You've got the foundation, and then you have the structure that's built right on top of it. It sounds simple, but trust me, the implications are huge.
All right, so let's start at the beginning, with the original blueprint. How did Marx himself actually lay this all out? Turns out his plans were way more specific than most people realize.
Okay, so for Marx, everything, and I mean everything, starts at the foundation, the base. And look, this isn't just the economy in some vague sense. No, he was talking about something very specific, the relationships between people when it comes to making stuff. Who owns the factories, the land, the capital, and who has to work for those owners. It really all boils down to class.
Then, sitting right on top of that economic foundation, you've got the superstructure. Now, this is a really important point. In his original work, Marx was super precise about this. The superstructure wasn't, everything else in society. It was specifically the legal and political stuff. We're talking about the government, the courts, the laws, that kind of thing.
And you can see this laid out perfectly in this famous quote from 1859. Marx is basically saying, look, the legal and political world doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. It grows directly out of the economic base. And what's its main job? To protect and justify the way things are already set up. I mean, think about it. Property laws don't just exist in a vacuum. They're there to protect the people who own property.
But here's where it gets interesting. After Marx, this neat little blueprint, it went through some major renovations. Later thinkers basically started adding on new rooms, new wings, even whole new floors to the superstructure. And in doing so, they changed the whole meaning of the building.
And you can see that difference right here. On the one hand, you've got Marx's laser-focused original idea. But on the other hand, you have this massively expanded view. This was pushed, in large part, by his collaborator Friedrich Engels and later Marxists. And suddenly, everything that isn't strictly economic gets thrown into the superstructure. We're talking religion, art, how families are set up, philosophy, basically the whole cultural shebang. Okay, but a problem started to emerge. Once you make the superstructure this enormous catch-all category, well, the whole building starts to look a little unstable. You start to see these big theoretical cracks appear, and people have been trying to fix them ever since.
The biggest criticism was this idea of economic determinism. I mean, if all of culture, our art, our beliefs, even how we structure our families is just a reflection of the economy, then what does that really mean? Does culture have any power of its own? Are our most profound ideas just, a passive echo of what the economy is doing? A lot of people started to say, hang on, that sounds way too simple.
So, to try and fix this, thinkers like Engels and later Louis Althusser came up with some clever adjustments. They said, okay, the economy is probably the ultimate cause, in the last instance, but it's not the only cause. They introduced ideas like relative autonomy, suggesting that things in the superstructure, like the state or the legal system, have their own internal logic. They can actually push back and influence the base. It's not just a one-way street anymore, it's more like a two-way conversation.
But then a really huge breakthrough came from an Italian thinker named Antonio Gramsci. He came up with a much more dynamic way of thinking about all this, especially about the real power of our ideas. He kind of took us beyond just thinking about a static building.
Gramsci's big idea is something he called cultural hegemony, and it's brilliant. He said, look, the people in charge don't just stay in charge by using force, with the police or the military. That's part of it, sure. But the real trick is getting everyone else to consent to their rule. And how do they do that? By making their own particular worldview seem like it's not a worldview at all. It's just common sense, the natural, inevitable way things are supposed to be.
So where does this common sense come from? Well, Gramsci pointed his finger at all these key institutions in our society, the things we're surrounded by every day. Our schools, the media we consume, religious institutions, political parties, even the family itself. He saw them as constantly working, often without us even realizing it, to shape our beliefs and make the status quo seem completely normal. But what if we've been looking at the blueprint all wrong? What if it's completely upside down? What if ideas don't just reflect the economy? What if ideas can actually build the economy? This was the radical suggestion from another giant of sociology, Max Weber, and it really turns the whole thing on its head.
And this, right here, shows you the core of the disagreement. For Marx, the arrow points up. The economic base shapes the cultural superstructure. Simple enough. But Weber, he just flips that arrow right around. He argued that at a key moment in history, it was culture, a set of ideas that actually gave birth to a whole new economic system.
Weber's classic case study was the rise of modern capitalism. He said, you can't just explain this with economics, something else was needed, a new mindset. And he located that mindset in what he called the Protestant ethic. This was a new set of religious ideas that valued hard work, saving money, and being frugal, not just as good business, but as a moral calling. So for Weber, a religious idea, something from the superstructure, was the actual engine that created the economic base of capitalism.
Okay, so that's the historical debate. But what about now? How does this 150-year-old argument about buildings and blueprints help us understand the world today? Well, as it turns out, it's still an incredibly useful way to look at things.
People use this framework all the time to analyze what's happening around us. For instance, they'll argue that the economic base of today's capitalism, with its constant need for growth and profit, is always putting pressure on the superstructure. You see this in debates about things like public services. Why is there a push to privatize healthcare or education? Well, one argument is that the base is trying to reshape the superstructure to serve its own needs. Or think about global institutions like the IMF that might push developing countries to change their laws, their superstructure, to better fit the demands of global finance.
So, in the end, that leaves us right back where we started. Are we all just living in a house designed and built by the economy? Or do our ideas, our culture, and our beliefs hold the blueprints to build something new? This whole debate doesn't really give us one easy answer. But what it does give us is a powerful set of tools to really examine the world we live in and ask who or what is really in charge.